What chance did a woman have in a naval courtroom where the statutes, the judges, and the assumptions all spoke with the same voice? Piracy was not only unlawful, it was unnatural for a woman to commit. The honest answer, preserved in dry ledgers and chilling verdicts, is almost none. During the 17th and 18th centuries, the so-called Golden Age of piracy, British Admiralty courts pursued pirates with relentless certainty. Female defendants were treated as doubly defiant offenders against the Crown and against the role society assigned them. In this system, a few names still echo. Anne Bonny and Mary Read stood before the bench in 1720 at Spanish Town, Jamaica. Women who had sailed and fought and concealed their identities until capture made secrecy impossible. The court transcript preserves a final spark of defiance. When Calico Jack was condemned, Bonny's bitter farewell cut sharper than any sentence. If you had fought like a man, you would not hang like a dog. Their plea, like that of other accused women, was one of the few legal protections available, pleading the belly. It did not acquit, it delayed. It recognized a life within, not the life on trial. In their case, the reprieve held only for a time. For most women, there was no such interlude. The verdict arrived as swiftly as the indictment, and the gavel simply confirmed what the courtroom had already decided. The river that curled past, Wapping, carried ships toward the sea. But on certain mornings, its current bore witness to another kind of procession. From Newgate Prison, carts rumbled over cobblestones, guarded by soldiers and flanked by curious crowds. Inside sat those condemned by the Admiralty, bound for the gallows at execution dock. The scene became ritual, one designed to impress itself on memory. Chains rattling, drums beating, faces pressed against windows to glimpse the spectacle. For men, the charges were familiar. For women, rarer, but no less severe. The journey was weighted with layers of disbelief. That a woman had dared to live as a pirate was already scandalous. That she now sat under guard, condemned, was meant to shock and instruct in equal measure. British law left no uncertainty. The Piracy Act of 1698 declared the crime punishable by death for all and every person who defied the Crown's authority at sea. At execution dock, the words became flesh. The gallows stood close enough to the Thames that the tide lapped beneath it, as if to claim those who had once used the water for freedom. The symbolism was pointed. Piracy was born at the sea, and the sea itself would be witness to its punishment. Crowds gathered by the hundreds, drawn as much by curiosity as by fear. Knowing they were about to watch empire speak in its harshest voice, women condemned for piracy were treated with the same finality as men. They were led beneath the noose, the verdict already pronounced. The method itself added cruelty. Unlike land-based executions, where a long drop ensured swiftness, here the short rope meant strangulation stretched into minutes. Movements slowed, limbs jerked, breath faltered. The people who watched called it the marshal's dance, a grim phrase that masked suffering with performance. It was a reminder that even death could be made into theater, choreographed to serve the state's lesson. Though their numbers were few, women did hang here. Mary Critchett, an American woman who joined a crew of convicts turned pirates in 1729, was captured near Virginia. Tried swiftly, she was condemned, marched through Williamsburg, and executed with no reprieve. No plea of pregnancy, no delay, no mercy. Her story flickers briefly in records before vanishing into silence. What remains is the certainty. The law showed no softness for her sex. It sought example, not exception. The ritual did not end with death. For some, especially those deemed notorious bodies, were left suspended until the tide rose and fell 3 times. Salt water washed the feet of the hanged before the crowd dispersed. This practice, called gibbeting, was more common for men, yet the threat itself carried weight for all. It was not only the body that was punished, right? It was the memory. To leave the condemned exposed was to turn them into warnings that lingered after breath had gone, a message written not in ink, but in sight and smell. These executions were meant to terrify, but they also transformed women from figures of legend into instruments of order. A woman who at once commanded on deck became, in death, an example displayed to prove that rebellion would always be crushed. Whatever notoriety they carried into the trial was stripped away on the scaffold, their names preserved not as individuals, but as cautionary tales. The gallows erased what the sea had allowed. The empire reclaimed its narrative with every rope tightened, and so the dock itself became a stage. The Thames rolled on, indifferent, but those who gathered remembered. They carried the image of the gallows back into taverns and marketplaces, retelling the morning's events. The condemned could no longer speak, but their silence was filled with the empire's voice. In that silence, fear traveled farther than any ship could sail. Before the noose, many women met another sentence: the lash. Flogging was one of the oldest punishments in naval tradition, and in the 17th and 18th centuries, it became a common tool against those accused of piracy. For women, it carried an added layer of spectacle. Their suffering was not hidden away in a cell, but brought before the public, where each strike was intended to sting not only flesh, but reputation. The body became the page upon which authority wrote its warning. The instrument was the kato, 9 tails, a whip made of multiple knotted cords. Each lash tore skin, leaving marks that lingered for days, sometimes forever. Sentences varied: a dozen strokes for lesser offenses, or stretches of punishment that climbed into the hundreds. Executions ended life. Flogging carved fear into the living. The sound itself, the crack of cord against flesh, was as much a message as the scars it left. Crowds gathered eagerly. The punishment was carried out on docks, in markets, outside prison gates. Children were present. Merchants paused their trade. Women leaned from windows. All watched as the condemned was tied and struck, their cries mingling with the salt air. For female pirates, this public humiliation was sharpened by gender. It was not only defiance of law that was punished, but defiance of role. A woman who had fought aboard a ship, commanded a crew, wielded a pistol, was shown stripped of power, reduced to a warning before all who saw. This is a story about disappearance. Not every woman captured at sea met her fate at the gallows or under the lash. Some vanished into quieter, less visible forms of punishment, their freedom exchanged for forced labor or coerced companionship. In the colonial ports of the Caribbean, in the markets of West Africa, and in the towns of the Americas, female prisoners were sometimes absorbed into systems of concubinage or slavery. Though records are often fragmentary, what survives suggests a pattern. Women taken as spoils, tatas, their stories silenced. In Spanish and Portuguese territories, where privateering, piracy, and slavery blurred into one another, captured women were often processed as property. Ships seized near Portobello or Cartagena recorded the presence of women, some listed as captives, others as crew. In either case, their fate was similar. They were transferred into households, plantations, or garrisons, treated not as defendants to be tried, but as commodities to be distributed. The empire's law intersected with its economy and both demanded obedience. Race and class deepened the divide. Black and mixed-race women found aboard pirate vessels were often presumed to be enslaved already, regardless of their actual status. Colonial officials rarely asked whether they had chosen piracy or been forced into it. Their lives folded into plantation economies, absorbed into domestic labor, or claimed by officials who saw them as personal spoils. In such cases, the line between punishment and exploitation dissolved. What mattered was not guilt or innocence, but availability. The absence of records is telling. Court transcripts describe trials and verdicts. Execution broadsheets preserve the names of the condemned. But for women sent into bondage, history leaves almost nothing. Their stories end in silence because silence was the point. Unlike a gallows scene designed to terrify or a flogging meant to humiliate, forced servitude erased it. It removed the woman from the narrative entirely, folding her into an unrecorded existence where she could no longer inspire fear or admiration. This fate was not unique to pirates. Across colonial society, women displaced by war, conquest, or capture endured the same. But for female pirates, the punishment carried an added sting. They had stepped beyond the boundaries of gender and law, and the empire responded, not with the finality of death, but with the suffocating permanence of erasure. Their resistance was buried beneath anonymity. Their names, if spoken at all, survived only in whispers or in the margins of shipping manifests. To imagine their lives after capture is to confront the limits of what history chose to preserve. Some may have labored in kitchens, others in fields, others in the private quarters of powerful men. Their days blurred into cycles of work and command, their pasts deliberately forgotten. What had once made them extraordinary, the decision to sail, to fight, to claim space on the waves, was ground down until nothing remained but utility. For the empire, this was victory. A hanged pirate became a warning. A flogged pirate became a lesson. But a woman absorbed into servitude disappeared completely. Her example could no longer inspire rebellion because she no longer existed in the public mind. The silence was strategic. The erasure was intentional. And in that silence, countless stories of resistance were lost. For some, the end did not come in the courtroom, at the gallows, or even in the hidden confines of servitude. Instead, it came slowly, quietly, and far from the public eye on the hulks of prison ships. By the 18th century, when land-based prisons overflowed, these floating jails became the crown's answer to the problem of confinement. For captured pirates, men and women alike, these vessels were often the last horizon. Conditions aboard were unbearable. Prisoners were chained in cramped holds where air barely circulated and light rarely reached. Food was scarce. Water was often foul. Disease spread rapidly, carried in the breath of the sick and the bites of vermin. Typhus, dysentery, and smallpox claimed lives faster than the rope. For women, vulnerability doubled. In addition to hunger and illness, they faced exploitation and mistreatment by guards or sailors. Unlike executions, which were staged as public warnings, the prison ships enforced a quieter punishment. Those confined there disappeared from view. They were not paraded before crowds or memorialized in broadsheets. They simply faded into absence, swallowed by the stench and darkness below deck. For the empire, this too was effective. A hanged pirate might inspire tales. A vanished one left nothing but silence.